In this recitation period, we're going to be focusing on youth experience and antiquity in the Middle Ages. One thing that sociologists note is that there are some unchanging conditions between youth and adults throughout the ages. First is that there's this generational gap that it seemed to have existed since the beginning of history between children and adults. One of the reasons why that may be the case is because sociologists see how children, adolescents, and youths, or minors, in other words, can be considered a minority class. Because if we look back through every historical period, we can see that children have been given less power, prestige, and wealth in comparison to their adult counterparts. So when you think about children, decisions about laws and rules and policies have always been made by adults, and up until recently, without any, and even continuing to till today, little input from children. So laws, rules, and policies that have been put in place to govern children have been based on conceptions of youth made by adults, and often differ from reality. So if we look back through the ages, even some of the conceptions of youth from the periods of antiquity, like the period of ancient Greece, we see some erroneous and very common types of misconceptions about children, adolescents, and young adults. These particular examples come from a very famous philosopher, Aristotle. So Aristotle stated that he felt the youth were too sexually promiscuous, they were overly violent in comparison to their adult counterparts, and most importantly, they didn't listen to adults. We don't just see this in examples of ancient Greek philosophy. The entire, Greek mythological, set of tales includes lots of examples of both bad kids and bad parents. So if you look, for instance, at the example of Cronius, the son of Gaia, he castrates his father to get back at him, and his father, to get back at the son Cronius, eats all further offspring, with the exception of Zeus, his son that gets away and then eventually challenges him to war. Another great example of this is the story of Bellerophon, which not only turns up in ancient Greek mythology, it also parallels the story of Cain and Abel, so two brothers misbehaving. If we skip forward to the Middle Ages, we can start to begin to see evidence of how children were treated in relation to other family members, including adults. The first thing that we need to note about the Middle Ages is that the family was really the central unit for social control of children. Most problems were resolved through the family. Children weren't punished by formal systems of justice, but instead through the family. However, we do see examples in historical writings of the time of examples of public beatings, dunkings, and children being put in the stocks, as well as execution of children. And one of the things that we note is that during this period of time, children were really thought of as little adults. And we can actually see depictions of this in some of the artwork of the time. So here are three examples of, art that was created during the period of the Middle Ages. One thing to note is that much of Middle Age art is religious themed, so we have examples here of Jesus meeting John the Baptist for the first time. We have an example of Jesus and Mary and another example of Jesus and Mary. If you look at how the children were painted and some of the actions that they're doing within the paintings, you can see that children are being depicted very similar to the adults surrounding them. And this really has to do with how children were conceptualized during this period of time, that they had all of the same capacities, ability to think and reason as adults did, that was born within them. The reason for this is that the strong religious undercurrents of the time, especially in Europe, focused on the notion of original sin, which was the general and non-personal condition of sinfulness or lack of holiness to which human beings are born. This really had to do with the story of Adam and Eve, and the fact that when they ate the fruit of knowledge, they really had the seeds of future evil effects sown within them and all of the ancestors that preceded them. So children were really thought of as having a need to be cleansed from this type of sin. And this included, or this cleansing process really included certain types of religious rituals, but also strict control over children, that children really need to be punished and kept from their natural propensity towards evil acts. And we even see carryovers of this into the strictness of Catholic schooling and other type of parochial school training during the 20th and 21st centuries. Another thing to note about children prior to the Industrial Revolution and modern period is that, there was a large chance that children would not survive into adulthood. This was especially true during the period of the Middle Ages. So, for instance, this period encompassed one of the most deadly plagues of all human history, the bubonic plague, which killed about two-thirds of those who were infected within 4 days. It was estimated that about 30 to 60% of Europe's population was killed during the series of outbreaks that lasted for about 50 to 52 years. And one of the things that we need to note is that children were especially susceptible during this period of time, so it contributed to a culture of morbidity in Europe. Parents learned not to get attached to their children. In addition to not being attached to your children, the economic system during this period of time really kind of split European population into a small but very powerful landowning nobility, and then a large group of people who were dependent on that landowning nobility known as the worker serfs. And serf children really helps serve the family as well as the economic structure of agrarian manneralism by helping with the farming. Parents had an economic incentive to have lots of children because children were an economic asset. They were, in fact, labor that could be used for tilling and planting and taking care of the farm. And so we see laws during this period of time, whenever it came to children, as focusing them as being part of what's known as a more general category known as chattel, which is personal property owned by the head of the household. So chattel includes things like livestock, slaves, children, the master of the house wife, as well as any of their agricultural produce that crops up on their own farm. And so as, being categorized as part of chattel, children had very, very little, very few rights in comparison to what we would think to be basic human rights today. So, for instance, a head of the household, the father of the house, had the ability of, the control of life or death over his children, especially children who would misbehave or be disobedient or, in other words, stubborn. So we see lots of examples, or several examples, of the state actually stepping in to kind of back up that family structure in the form of stubborn child laws. In the United States, we see stubborn child laws crop up on the books starting in 1646 that says that a stubborn or rebellious son can be brought before the court and put to death for basically being disobedient within the family. So here's the state kind of backing up that structure of a family being the central unit of economic and social life. If that child is not obedient within the family, the state will kind of step in to back up that family structure. We see stubborn child laws also enacted in places like Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire. So it was throughout the New England colonies during this period of time. And we see common law and other legal precedents reflect the same type of legal treatment of children as being property or chattel of the master of the household. So with that, we're going to stop and move on to our next section.